All right, welcome to the August 22nd, 2023 Aries Cloud Agent Python user group community meeting. Lots of topics on the agenda, mostly to do with PRs and progress on those. This is the time frame for massive PRs, massive numbers of files changing. So we have to talk about that and sort of understand the ramifications of that. We are recording the call, so we'll post it after the meeting for anyone that misses. This is a Linux Foundation Hyperledger meeting, so the Linux Foundation antitrust policy is in effect, which is listed on your screen, on the screen that I am displaying as well. It's a Hyperledger meeting, so the code of conduct is in effect. Let's be good to one another. Feel free, I posted in the chat the link to the agenda if you want to call it up, add your name to the attendees, and help out with taking notes. That'd be great. Is anyone new to the call and would like to introduce themselves and any comments, questions, or why they're here and joining the community? Looks like I recognize most people on the call.
I can introduce myself.
Good.
I'm Gavin. I'm working with Cortec as well as the BC government. Happy to be working on the Hyperledger project.
Awesome. And Gavin is one of the people that are changing large numbers of files. Although I guess your count of files is not that many, but the impact is fairly large on the project. So we'll want to talk about what you've been up to. Okay, feel free to jump in with topics for open discussion after, either adding it in to the agenda directly yourself or prepare to talk about it when we have the chance. We're going to start with 2409. And this is the pretty large change to do with the handling of DIDs during DIDCOM connection establishment, and enables the use of public DIDs such as DID-Web DIDs as for DIDCOM connections. And it generally makes it easier to do use a variety of DID methods for DIDCOM. So Daniel, do you want to share your screen or how do you want to do this?
Yeah, I'll share my screen.
Okay. Over to you.
Cool. Let's see. Make sure I share the right one here. How's that look?
Good.
Okay. Cool. So as Stephen mentioned, the goal of these changes is to ultimately enable connecting for DID communication over more than just the unqualified legacy DIDs that we were originally using within ACA-Pug. So this one is focused on using our DID, which is set as the public DID for the wallet, which with recent changes handled in other PRs can now be DID-Web DIDs and others if you have plugins that are implementing the method and resolution of those DIDs. So this is expanding ACA-Pug's support for communicating over DIDCOM with multiple DID methods. So I've got a summary here on the PR itself, which is fairly detailed. I'll kind of skim over and give the highlights of each of these sections. I'll start with probably the more interesting chunk here, which is the actual usage of public DIDs during DID exchange. So originally in ACA-Pug, this has been supported for quite some time, but we had the ability to send a DID exchange request to a public DID, and that was done using the DID exchange create request endpoint. And on that method, there was a use public DID parameter, which allowed us to use our public DID as the DID that was being sent out in that request to their public DID. So this has been around for a while. What I've changed in this PR is that instead of generating a DID document based off of the DID as stored in the wallet and based off of the endpoints that are configured for the ACA-Pug instance, we are actually no longer including a DID doc attachment in the DID exchange request altogether. So instead, we just send only the DID. Since it is a public DID, it should be resolvable by the other side. And so that was kind of the critical change for ACA-Pug, was being able to send and receive DID exchange requests and responses, as I'll talk about in a second for the accept request method, and to be able to resolve the keys and endpoints associated with that DID to establish a connection.
Daniel,
Yes.
quick question here. So this leads right into these changes would be necessary in order to use DID peer 2, correct? Because DID peer 2 is going to be doing the same thing. It's just going to be sending a DID and no DID doc.
Yes, exactly. So this is exactly the kind of change that is required, being able to process requests and responses without attached DID documents, and then the associated resolution of the DIDs that were received. Yeah, that's exactly what we need for peer DIDs, basically.
Awesome. Okay.
Yep. So this PR, of course, doesn't go quite all the way to that point. Focusing instead on being able to use the DID that's been set as public within the wallet as our outbound peer DID, or excuse me, our outbound DID that's reported in the DID exchange request and response.
Yeah.
Let's see. Some other minor details on that front, since these are public DIDs. These DIDs were actually previously being sent out unqualified in the request, even when we were attaching the DID document with our public DID in the case of the create request. So that's now been corrected. We're now sending fully qualified DIDs in DID exchange. Yeah, I think I've kind of covered most of the interesting stuff on that front. The other significant change that was made in order to support this was we are now resolving DIDs, like for real, resolving DIDs that we're receiving in DID exchange requests, instead of expecting the DID doc attachment to be available and on each message. So in order to keep the handling of DID exchange requests and then later messaging that connection that we've established through DID exchange, in order to help that be a more consistent process, regardless of whether it was received as a legacy peer DID with an attached DID document, or later when we do peer DIDs, I've adjusted the backend and how we're resolving. Resolving is kind of an abstract term, I suppose. How we're determining which endpoints and keys to send messages to based on a given connection. So we're now using the DID resolver interface in all cases to help us to resolve the connection information, help us to resolve those keys and endpoints. And then for those DIDs that we did receive with attached DID documents, so the legacy peer DID implementation, more or less, we're now using the legacy peer DID resolver, which was merged in a previous PR, 2404, to perform the resolution of those legacy peer DIDs by recalling it from the wallet. But in the cases where we are actually resolving public DIDs that are on a network rather than within our wallet, we need to make sure that we're doing that efficiently, especially since DIDCOM message exchanges take place usually in bursts of messages being sent back and forth. So if we hold up that, that DID indeed did or whatever it is, and that is a slow operation, we'd be recalling the DID document for each message that we're sending out. So rather than going through that, we are now caching the documents retrieved from the through the DID resolver interface. This was something that we just kind of marked as to do previously, The did resolver has been used more recently in new code, such as the JSON-LD implementation. So we actually do resolve dids in order to verify the JSON-LD credentials that we're verifying. But it hasn't been used quite as integrally within the connections up to this point. Stephen, you have your hand up?
I don't, but I'm thinking about that. So just to confirm what that would mean, does that mean before we send out a message, we would check the did? We would resolve the did? If we haven't sent a message out in some time for over an hour to a contact, we would resolve their did first?
That is correct.
That's really good.
Yep. Yeah,
that's something that I've always worried about in that if a contact rotates their key, you would send a message, but of course, because it's asynchronous, you would not get a response back, but you wouldn't know why you didn't get a response back. So this means that you would do it before sending a message, which is really good. Okay, good. Thank you.
There is a slight nuance in there that I'll call out briefly. So when we are messaging in DIDCOM v1, it's actually the keys themselves and the base 58 encoding of those keys are kind of like the quote unquote first class identifier for the connection still. We receive the recipient key and we use that to identify which connection in combination with the sender keys of the message. So in order to go from a inbound message and then to populate the context of which connection sent that message, we would take the key, look up the did, and then from the did, look up the connection. And I guess to be extra explicit, it's a combination of the sender and receiver did that we're using to look up the connection. We're able to look up our did just from our wallet, just as we normally would for going from key back to a did. But for their keys, we have to explicitly store a mapping from their keys to their did, so we can later use that information to populate that connection context.
Okay.
So for did doc attachments or our legacy period implementation, we were storing that mapping from their keys to their dids in our wallet when we were storing their did document that we received. So in the case where we're receiving a public did instead of an attached did document, we will go through the process of, during the did exchange, resolving their keys, and then constructing that mapping from their keys to their did. So again, that helps us for inbound connections and making sure that we know who sent the message based on their did and the connection information associated with it. So even though we are resolving their keys in their endpoint each time we send out a message, I haven't gone through the process yet of determining when, if we have resolved a document recently, like what the hook is to update our mapping from their keys to their did so we can populate the inbound messages. So there's some future work there, in short. But yeah. What was I saying? I think I was seeing the hand raised notification that you had previously, so that's why I interrupted myself there to ask if you had questions. But yeah, so I was talking about caching, added a caching layer to the base resolver, which is the class that method resolvers will implement. So this is the class that the ND resolver, the did key resolver, the legacy period resolver, that's the class that is implemented by each of those. And then each of those instances of each of those classes are registered with the global did resolver, which is the thing that handles the delegation of resolution based on the did method, and assigns it out to each of these different instances. So the caching is implemented at the base resolver layer, meaning that if you have needs for your did method for tuning the caching in whatever way makes sense, that is possible based on the plugged in resolver implementation. So I've actually done that for the legacy pure did resolver, in addition to caching the document itself, so we don't have to go all the way to the wallet to pull it out. I've also stored some additional metadata that just makes it easier to determine whether the did that we're looking at is a legacy pure did, or if it's a published public did solve did. So yeah, there's an example of overriding this caching behavior already in the code base available for us to check out if it ever becomes necessary for other did methods. Yeah, so that's the bulk of the features. The other big changes that are included in this PR, though.
You have a question? Warren's got his hand up.
Sure.
Yeah, is this caching layer then on a process basis, or is it in some shared cache, like in Redis or something like that?
So we are using the abstract caching interface for ACA-Pug. So that means that by default, it will use a per process in-memory caching system. But there are plugins available for caching through Redis, for instance. So if you wanted to have a shared cache across a cluster, you can do that with that plugin.
That's awesome. I was just going to ask the same question. Excellent.
Okay. Connection management refactors is also worth talking about here. So some time ago, I assume it was at the introduction of the did exchange protocol to ACA-Pug. I'm not actually sure if that's the case or not, but that's just my guess. But at some point in the past, we introduced a base connection manager and moved some of the functions for handling like connection context population on inbound messages, things like storing did documents and all that stuff. And it's supposed to be a common location for code that's used by both the connections protocol and the did exchange protocol, as well as a non-protocol specific layer for just interacting with connections generally, which we do from many points within the code base, both in the protocol implementations and outside of the protocol implementations. So at some point in the past when that transition took place, it was kind of like half done. I'm not exactly sure what the reasoning was for not moving over everything to that base connection manager was, but I've gone ahead and done that now, basically. So everything that was previously living in the connections protocol v1 manager that didn't have something to do strictly with the connections protocol itself, I've moved all of that into the base connection manager. That was actually quite a significant amount of code, and the thousands of lines of actual functions being moved, and then a couple more thousand lines in moved tests. But it's more or less a copy paste or cut paste, I suppose. So none of the code has really changed significantly. I've done some improvements to help with type hinting and to increase code coverage from our tests for that code. But that's more or less unchanged otherwise there.
Quick question.
So yeah.
Explain the decreasing the cyclomatic complexity.
Yes, that is, so cyclomatic complexity is a measure of how complex a method is based on the control structures and the different branching paths through the method.
Okay.
So it's, I used a tool called McCabe, which is the name of the scholar who came up with this term for cyclomatic complexity. It's debatable whether it's a good measure for like overall code quality. It doesn't necessarily indicate more or less buggy code to have higher or lower cyclomatic complexity, but it's a good metric for evaluating and being able to analyze at a high level what methods might need attention in terms of being made more simple or breaking up into smaller, more digestible pieces. So it's helpful, I think, from a maintainability, readability perspective to include that in our reports. And I've got some additional discussion on that point on the other PR that I have open that's on the agenda, so we can talk some more about that. So in other words, I made the method a little bit simpler. Just broke up some of the branching conditions into separate methods that get called instead of being all within the same method.
That's funny. When I read that, I thought McCabe A was a contributor who had raised an issue, and cyclomatic complexity meant that you were calling a thing 9 times and you got it down to only calling it 4.
Yeah, no, not quite.
To figure out what the back and forth was that required so many messages or whatever. So that makes way more sense than where I went with that. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah, as far as these things go, 9 isn't actually all that bad. 10 is usually the threshold that's used for things that check for this complexity level. So it technically would come in under that line. There are other places in ACA-Pug that are a little bit worse, but yeah.
Okay.
Cool.
This
So
is ready to merge.
Sorry?
This is now ready to merge.
Correct. Yeah.
So other maintainers, please take a look at this as soon as possible. This is holding up the 0.10.0 RC1 that we want to put out. And then once it is done, we won't merge anything until 0.10.0 is released. I think this is the last one, and pending further discussions on this. Any more questions for Daniel on this? This is awesome. Thank you so much for this. This is huge.
Cool.
Cool. Okay, we'll go back to sharing. Thank you, Daniel.
Yep.
Okay. As mentioned, release 0.10.0 status. Once 2409 is completed, we'll do 0.10.0 RC1. After testing 0.10.0 released. Okay, so that's the plan for that. Is there anything else, looking at the PRs here, that we want to include, anything that's completed that we want to include in 0.10.0? Keeping in mind that since the last ACA-Pug, we now have nightly tests and nightly, sorry, not tests. We have nightly publication of a container image, so artifact publishing on a nightly basis. So anyone who wants to use a pending container image can just use the nightly for specific testing. So we no longer have to resort to you know, self-creation of a container image to use, but actually having a official, I guess is the wrong word, a developer container image from the repository directly to be used. So that's good. Okay, so nobody thinks there's anything else that needs to go into this release. So 2409 here, once review is complete, we'll get a new the RC1 release of 010 out, and then we'll go forward from there. So now we look at the 3 others. This one wasn't so, let's see, remind me of this. Yeah, just 21 lines or 21 files, but let's take a look at, say, this one. 459 files.
Yeah, that
All,
sounds fun.
it seems, are largely text changes. Daniel, do you want to talk about that and suggest a strategy for merging this one?
Yeah, let's see. So this is introducing rough as our linter over instead of Flake 8, which we were previously using.
So the first question, obviously, that needs to be asked is, why is it called rough?
That is a good question. I don't actually know. It is written in Rust, so I'm sure the RU might come from Rust somewhere or something like that. But yeah, so rough is an extremely fast linter. It also has a lot of the things that were previously plugins to Flake 8 built in. So there's fewer dependencies to manage. One of the bigger things I think that's encouraging us to switch over from Flake 8 to rough, though, is the PyTest Flake 8 library that we were using in order to actually cause test failures if there's a Flake 8 issue in added code is no longer being maintained. And so we've been stuck on an older version of Flake 8, haven't been able to update as a result of that. So this PR swaps out Flake 8 for rough, and then swaps out the PyTest Flake 8 for the PyTest rough plugin, which performs essentially the same function. So as part of running rough on the code base, it does have the ability to automatically fix certain categories of errors, which is what has happened here. So we generally follow the Google Python style guide for our doc strings. And there were a number of instances where we were just slightly out of spec with the Google Python doc style thing. And so most of these changes are just removing new lines from our doc strings, and that's the majority of the changes. There's some other smaller ones. For instance, it is not recommended to use in Python the type built-in function to get the type of an object, and then to check that against a list or dictionary or anything like that. It's instead preferred to use the is-instance built-in. So there was maybe a couple dozen of those instances that I had to go through and correct by hand. Yeah, so all these are good changes. I think all of them are pretty innocuous changes. I don't think we can expect to see any real changes in behavior as a result of these. It's all just style changes, more or less.
I noticed a bunch of things in the imports where I assume it's removing imports that are no longer being used or not used, not referenced in the actual file.
Right. Yep.
Yeah. That one's a funky one looking at that one. It's a test, but I guess somebody just automatically put that in because it's a test, but then didn't use it. Okay.
Yeah, I think that's the case for a number of our tests. A lot of imports were just copied from a previous test file to the next one that was needed. And yeah, so several test imports were removed that weren't being used.
Good. So again, post 010, now, as you mentioned, why is this going slow? And now why is my screen? Are you still hearing me?
Yes.
Oh, interesting. My screen seems to have, there we go. All right, I've been debating buying a new machine. I think this tells me I need to do it. It's time to buy a new device. Okay, the next one that comes up is this one that has 152 file changes. Shanjot, I noticed you put this ready for review. The changes are, so this PR is intended to allow in a multi-tenant basis extraction of logs by per tenant so that we can have a multi-tenant environment and show the logs to a tenant without them seeing the logs of any other client or any other tenant in the instance. So we're using that in an OpenShift world where we're running a multi-tenant ACA-Pug with different business areas owning the tenants, and obviously we want to separate those out. So there is a lot of changes. I don't know, is Shanjot here? Yes. you are.
Yes.
So 152 files.
So basically, the mechanism for it is in config fold in the config directory. There's a logging .py. So basically the mechanism for the logging is in there. But what it is doing on a high level is basically if a logging file startup parameter is provided, it implements a time rotating file handler basically for backup management, so that after let's say if you provide like 7 days, so after 7 days it'll give like remove all the previous backups and keep the new ones. And also it also can do the backup counts, like how many backup files you want like to keep aggregating on. So it provides that kind of a customization. That was already introduced in a previous PR and merged in ACA-Pug main. In here is basically all those files that that basically, and the identifier for the tenant is basically the DID. So the DID is being used as the identifier. So each line of the log will have the DID that basically from the wallet that try to that the log message is associated with. So the DID for that particular wallet will be included in that message as the identifier. And basically, all these changes basically it imports that particular function, get logger instance, and it provides the profile and the name of the file as the parameters for that function, and that in returns the logger instance. Earlier, the logger instance used to be just like at the start of the file, you could call the get logger function and provide the file name and get the logger instance. But now it's instead calling that function with the profile to get that particular logger instance. And then basically rest everything is pretty much the same, basically writing messages based on the level.
Okay. Comments from anyone? The only thing I can think of that kind of is Wade put in we have an instance coming up where we're going to try to move an existing wallet from using one instance of Indy to a different one with a different DID. So my ears perked up because I've been thinking about this morning, and in relative to that would be what happens if a wallet has multiple DIDs associated with it. I don't think that's a big issue. I think the worst thing that would happen here is that so I'm assuming, Shanjot, that somewhere there is a way, a client that accesses the log that says, I want to see it by DID, and calls it in. And so in theory, it could pass it. Does it put these in separate files by DIDs, or does it just, you can query it by DID?
No, basically, in ACA-Pug, what this is doing is basically putting everything together in one file, and then we'll be basically using like an elk stack or something separate, basically to display that log based on the identifier attached to each message. But what ACA-Pug is doing, basically aggregating everything with the identifier in a single file.
Okay, good. That should be fine then. Good. Okay. As mentioned, this will be held until after 0.10.0. So we won't do anything with this one yet. And again, my machine has slowed to a crawl. Oh, well. Okay, any questions or comments on this issue? And otherwise, this is now ready for review. So again, maintainers can look at it. Not as high priority as 2409. But we do have to, will want to do this after 0.10.0 is pushed. Okay, migrate to poetry. Okay, that's what I thought. This is a big change in that it makes a rather fundamental change in the project, but not that many files, just 14. Gavin, do you want to talk about this one, if you would?
Yeah, sure thing. So we're migrating away from the usual requirements and setup.py to using poetry. It's pretty familiar to a lot of other like build systems and packaging systems. Basically, the big thing that's going on here is mostly just moving away from all these custom requirements files. If you look down at that change right there, you can kind of see that we're importing all these different requirements, and now instead we can just use poetry install. In addition, we also get an actual lock file out of this. So now we can actually version lock all of the different dependencies, which will be really nice in the future. We won't have as many issues with version changes breaking everything, which will be really helpful. Especially we had a recent thing that I was correcting earlier that was basically a test on Python 3.10 that was failing. So that should be a bit easier to catch. That sort of stuff would be easier to catch in the future because it basically wouldn't build properly anymore. And yeah, so right now this has made a lot of progress. It's not completely finished right now. I'm just working on getting the integration tests all figured out, just because the way that the Docker files work at the moment is they're like loading new requirements files in the different Docker files. And so just testing all the different changes is just taking a while. But yeah, so this is coming along nicely. Hopefully this will be done in no time. Might need to reach out to a couple of people who are a bit more familiar with the actual integration tests, but yeah.
See this line here? You change
Yeah.
Indy to Aries agent code.
Sure thing. I can do that.
It'd be amazing to see how old this line of code is. This is where you get history going a long way back that doesn't get changed. This is really old. Excellent. Cool. Any questions about this shift to poetry? I read a bit this morning on poetry versus pip and the history, a bit of it, and the pros and cons. Looks good to me. Okay, you've got it in draft. What are your expectations for moving it to ready for review?
Really the only thing holding it back is the integration tests, like I mentioned before. So just because they it's just taking a while to get all of them tested. Right now the test in the GitHub action is broken, but I fixed that earlier. I just haven't pushed those changes yet.
Okay.
But yeah, the integration tests are really the only thing. Like so far, all the code and everything should be working. Just the Docker files that are used for that final test.
Okay, good. Excellent. Nice work. Good stuff. So that's that one. We've got that one covered. I believe this one will soon be ready to go or is ready to go again. We'll hold up till after. I think Andrew and this person has gone back and forth on getting the UTC and the time zones right. Didn't realize that, so I'll approve that to run. And they've come to agreement, I believe, on how to do this. So I suspect this will be ready to go once we get 0.10.0 out of the way. So again, holding up until 0.10.0. And this one's still in draft, Daniel, or any?
No real updates there. I just got it opened up and then said, yeah, this needs some more attention, but yeah, just been focusing on 2409 for the moment.
On other topics on these, we're still, Jason Sherman is making progress on AnonCred's Rust. Basically, now getting all of the endpoints that we want to continue to exist, making those work by calling the AnonCred's code. So for those not aware, the first pass of this was to create a new set of AnonCred's endpoints for things like creating a schema, creating a cred def, and so on. What Jason is doing now is changing the existing endpoints so that they basically are still exist, still work, but they call the AnonCred's implementations, and they don't continue to exist in their original form. They just call the AnonCred's implementations, but still work. There are some that are being removed. So anything that creates RevReg capabilities will be removed from the admin API so that can no longer be done. ACA-Pug will handle the creation of Rev registries as needed. So I think we've talked about this before. That's the major change there. We haven't done anything with endorsement yet, but that will happen, and it will be basically the same thing that will remove from the admin API. And I actually meant to have, I guess I can bring this picture across. Whoops. Oh, I see. I'll show this in a moment, but a picture of the admin endpoints for endorsement. And again, we're going to make it so that ACA-Pug knows, an ACA-Pug instance knows whether it's an author or an endorser, and will do the right thing without the controller having to make the explicit calls to do things. And again, that's already been implemented. There's few people likely using those endorser endpoints that don't need to be called directly, but ACA-Pug will handle the feature. So these are the endorser endpoints. I have not, I meant to do this before the call, and I apologize for that. I wanted to think through which of these would be removed and which would remain. Things like the create request will go away because that will be done automatically within ACA-Pug. So that one for sure, I think, will go away. These ones will probably remain, setting the role, but that's more configuration data, and quite frankly, the configuration does most of that. It may be reasonable to allow the controller to see transactions that are hung. It may be useful for the controller to resend them or have a policy to resend them. But we'll see about that, whether that one needs to remain. Emiliano, question.
Yeah, about the endpoints, we might want to assess what you were saying about what to remove and what to leave based on the work we're planning on doing on the endorser service. I'm concerned that some of these endpoints might be used by the API that the Hyperledger endorser service is using to control what's going on, and might need them. If there is a requirement to basically like change the behavior, so like create request goes away because everything is controlled by the auto flags or something like that, we're going to have to propagate that change accordingly.
There you're talking about the endorser itself versus the author.
Yeah, but I don't remember exactly how the protocol goes, but like I'm not sure how it needs to be initiated. I don't remember how it needs to be initiated.
Whoops. These will remain. The endorser ones where you see for endorser, they will remain.
Okay, so
It's
it's just like,
author ones
okay,
that are questionable. Like the author shouldn't have to the author being the controller of the author shouldn't actually have to do the create request. It should say, oh, create a schema. And the schema should say, hey, we're using an indie ledger and it needs an endorser. So I'm going to call an endorser before I actually write this. And all of that will be handled within ACA-Pug. The author will not have to do anything.
okay, yeah. In that case, I think it makes more sense. Thanks.
Yeah, the endorser ones for sure would do things. The endorser controller will be able to make these changes. Okay. Jason, I sort of said what I was thinking of. Any other comments from you?
Just kind of cut out there on
in the United States?
I couldn't quite hear what you're saying. It kind of cut out, so I don't know if it's me or you.
Oh, sorry, but I just wondered if you wanted to add anything else about the non-creds Rust work.
Yeah, I mean, it's coming along. One thing that I maybe have to discuss with Daniel, the biggest change is create schema. Currently, there's kind of two different types of response bodies. One that's transaction based and one that's like the schema. And I'm not sure if we can do the transaction style in the non-cred. So I've just implemented it using the, I guess, quote unquote, regular style. So that's something that we might need to discuss that's different. I don't know if people are expecting a transaction ID response from create schema or not. So we might have to address that. But other than that, it's just plugging through that stuff. So working on cred desk now, and then we'll do the revocation cleanup one, which is documented in the issue. There's a fair number, as you alluded, fair number of those API endpoints going away. So
yeah. Okay. Transaction style, like that one. Oh, well, we don't have to go into that.
I can discuss it with Daniel to see if it is doable that way. And then when it comes time for that, we can kind of make that more public and people can chime in to say whether they are expecting that payload back or not.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then finally, an update on the qualified peer dids. Jason Syro is not here, I don't think.
I'm on.
Oh, yes, he is. There he is. Good. You want to give an update on where things are with that?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I was looking. Originally, I was going to implement like a peer did 2, and it was focused on that. But kind of what we realized is that the actual identifier is a did peer 3, and we're treating did peer 2 more like identifier plus doc, all encoded as one, used in kind of the introduction in the first set of circumstances. So that changed the approach a little bit. So yeah, so we've been making updates to this branch. It's still in draft. The happy path is working with exchanging did peer 2s and then updating both sides so they both store did peer 3s as the opposing identifier, because that's what you're going to see in future requests. And if at any point you need to, you can still look at the doc that you've stored and re-verify that it is in fact the same did peer 3 that's happening. Yeah, the issues around some of the workflow with the tests involve you create a did first, and then you do some processing on that, and then you create the document, and then you do some processing on that. Well, that doesn't really work because the did peer 2s are intertwined. They're kind of synonymous. So there's some tiptoeing that I've had to do to make sure that the existing behavior works properly, which is that we will still need to be able to accept and send unqualified dids to preserve the old behavior until the community coordinated update completes. So that's been part of the struggles as well. And then just updating tests in certain circumstances. Also part of this is updating, the big crux of this is that ACA-Pug uses a custom did doc class for connection did docs. And we are are hoping to get away from that because there is PyDid library has a good one that enforces a lot more type checking and things like that. So that's also part of the complexity is updating those old documents into new ones. But given the context is only for connections, it should be relatively simple. But that is part of the process as well. I'm just trying to figure out how many of the tests are completely obsolete and have no bearing on reality and we should throw out. And some of them are worth updating and preserving. So most of them are sticking around, but there are some changes to those that should be pretty easy to identify if someone takes a look. Yeah, so I'll announce when it's ready for a more thorough review. But if you want to see what's coming down the pipeline, that PR is available, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions.
Excellent. Thanks. I looked and didn't see you earlier. Were you here for the early part where Daniel was talking about this 2409 change?
Came in about halfway through, but I have been looking at that. I left some comments and I'll review that today because it's obviously related to the work that I've been doing. Yeah, and if that's ready to go, we should put that in, and I'll probably have to deal with some conflicts, but it also resolves some of the issues that I'm also doing. So yeah, it'd be good to see that.
I was thinking that it deals with a bunch of things you need to. So if you missed, I'd listen to the recording perhaps just for the early part.
Yeah, I might make sure to get the whole context of it, but I'm aware of that. So yeah, I'll review that today.
Good. Okay. Few seconds left. We've covered poetry, flake 8 and rough, nightly builds. Daniel, did you add these ones?
I did. So those are a couple of really old issues that talk about updating to send the HTTPS prefix for message types by default. And the other one is a similar change for the media types associated with the messages that are being sent out. So I was just kind of wondering, like, is it time to pull the trigger on these kind of changes? Like, we've had support for the HTTPS prefix for some time, and it can be activated by a flag. So yeah, just wondering if it's time to invert the behavior and have HTTPS be sent out by default and turn on a flag for old style if you need it.
I would think so. These might be, Gavin, you might want to, you may get drafted into these if these are, this one especially has been bothering me for a long time. Whenever I go through a test and I see the old style prefix. So yeah, I think we should. So let's add a high priority on this one, or let's put a help wanted flag on it just so we can see these more easily. And we can figure out how to get these to move forward.
Cool.
Yeah, it's definitely long overdue that we get rid of the old behavior. Those two, those are old. All right. Any other issues to raise on this call? Great discussion, much appreciated. Awesome work being done. I really appreciate it. We all really appreciate it. Good stuff. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Yeah.
You too.
Thanks. Nice meeting you, everyone.
Thanks.